Hello and welcome to Adapt with Danette FM. My name is Danette Fenton Menzies and I'm the host of this podcast. We're currently in season 3 where we are looking at experimentation. And I'm super excited today to have a conversation with Dr. Richard Hodge. But before we get there, Jez FM, our executive producer for our podcast, welcome. And what are we going to be talking about today?
Well, Danette, thank you for having me, and welcome, listeners. Very excited to have you for season 3, where we're going to be looking at experimentation. But why are we looking at experimentation? Well, the reason is this podcast is actually a companion podcast to the Adaptable Leader, the amazing book by Danette FM, our wonderful host. Now, in that book, you have an accepts model where you are looking at different elements, and the E in accepts stands for experimentation. So this season, we're focusing on that to help people stay adaptable. If you want to learn about some of the other ones, you can check out our previous seasons where we focus on different elements as well. But Danette, today we're going to be talking to Dr. Richard Hodge, and it's going to be very exciting. But before we do that, we want to look at some global issues and see how they relate to adaptability through your lens. So I think it's time to turn on the news program for the Adapt podcast, Adapt the News. Alrighty, welcome to Adapt the News. Latest bulletin in for us this week is coming from a medical journal, and this is one that if you like to relax, it's going to be great for you. All right, so this is from neurosciencenews.com, Danette, and it is actually a new study. And the headline is, Meditation Retreat Sparks Rapid Brain and Immune System Changes. And so this is just to quickly give everybody the summary here. A week-long retreat combining meditation and mind-body healing produced significant changes in brain activity and blood biology, demonstrating how consciousness-based practices can transform physical health. Participants showed reduced default mode activity, enhanced neural connectivity, elevated natural opioids, immune activation, and metabolic shifts effects that extend beyond the brain into the entire body. So, Danette, we were actually having a little interesting conversation about this before before we got onto the recording today. So did you want to tell us a little bit about what this article means about adaptability and what your relation to this article is?
So this is based on a week-long meditation retreat run by Dr. Joe Dispenza. And for any of those listeners and viewers who like the Diary of a CEO, he was interviewed recently by Stephen Bartlett. And he was talking about the retreats that he runs. And so I'd actually been looking at these retreats before I read this article. What I love about it is, and I was also reading an article this week about chaos theory and how they were saying that they were looking at people who were lucky, and they were talking about part of quantum physics and chaos is that when we focus on things, it has impacts on those things. And so, when we're spending time being mindful, we're doing practices around meditation and other things, that's the science is now showing that actually has an impact on our, health, etc., how our brain works and that. So how wonderful. If you think about it, when I think about adaptability, I think about the left and the right brain, and the left brain is more structured, more planning. The right brain is a little bit more creative and free-flowing. And when we get into meditation, we're calming the critical part of our brain down, and we're letting the brain sort of become more conscious and more aware because the chatter stops. And when I think about adaptability and experimentation, those states of being calm and curious actually help us do better. So I loved this particular article, and it made me go back to the retreats to have a look at it. And I'm pretty sure I'm going to go to one in April because it looks amazing.
Well, the neuroscience would agree there, Danette. So I think it's got to be a must there.
Exactly.
This article I thought was interesting, and I guess it's part study, part article. Honestly, it really is. Honestly, looking at the study just pretty specifically. But what I was going to say is one thing that I've sort of been focusing on around this is I wonder how much of general anxiety, and I don't think it's all of it. I think it might be like 10 or 20%, might be just related to physical strain that we're not acknowledging, because I think everybody's got something that's a bit sort of done, like, maybe you've got a knee that didn't set right at some point when you were younger. Everyone's got low-lying pain. And I was thinking about if your body is constantly in low-lying pain, then that's likely to trigger stress receptors. So I think when you go
Correct.
on these retreats, what could be happening is when you're becoming more in tune with what your body needs, you're better able to serve that and relax
Yeah.
that part, along with just being generally less stressed. But you're able to relax actually the physical elements of yourself that may actually be inducing a slight level of sustained anxiety over time. And just
Yes.
a tip that I learned that sort of triggered all this was I saw someone talk about how a lot of people don't know where they're holding a lot of tension. It can be actually, it's quite easy for us to dull out that kind of feeling. But a
Yes.
really good one where we store a lot of tension for a lot of people is right behind the jaw. And so if you actually
Ah.
take your two thumbs and you squeeze this muscle that's just sort of behind your jaw here, a lot of people find that very tender. And if you hold that for about 3 minutes, it'll start to release a different acid that'll help
Oh.
relax it. So you can start there as a way to relax some of the muscles in your body because that's connected to all these sort of skull muscles that can also get quite tender. There's also a little place at the base of your skull here that you can press that also is quite tender, where your trap meets your skull. That's another place that you can sort
Love
of try
that.
and relieve a bit of pain. But anyway, this is something else on top of the general relief. I just think that that would be a small part of it that people can do today.
I love that.
Mm.
Jez, and this week I got the opportunity to be part of a meditation with Dr. Saraswati, and she's an Ayurvedic doctor based in India. And we were doing the scanning of my body to work out where I was holding tension in my shoulders, but also in my right hip and my right knee. And so we did a guided meditation. And that night I slept like a log, but also I often get twitchy knees and hips. None of that happened. It hasn't happened since. And she was very much saying, and I've read books around this, that our body basically not holds stuff, as you said. And so getting conscious and subconsciously then using things like meditation to actually release those patterns, super, super effective. Anyway, massive thank you to Dr. Saraswati. Awesome, awesome experience.
I mean, Danette, I'm sure people are interested. Do you just want to give us a quick rundown of sort of what that hip knee thing was? Because that sounds, I mean, it sounds amazing. It sounds like people got to go check out Dr. Saraswati. But I mean, just like a
Yes.
little insight as to kind of a little bit of an idea of what you were kind of going through.
Yeah, so it's about masculine energy and it was about money. So it was really, really interesting. And she was saying that my mum's dad had issues around money, my dad similarly, and not that they didn't have money, although I'm not so sure about my mum's dad, but my dad does, but still has that sort of poverty mindset. So it was just really interesting because she was sort of saying, I didn't have the strength there because I was sort of engaging in their stories versus actually knowing that the world's abundant and stuff like that. So it was such a beautiful way to release it through guided meditation. And just that reminder that while we think our logical mind knows most of the stuff, it only does about 10% of our processing. 90% is subconscious. So tools like meditation, the retreat that Dr. Joe Dispenza runs and many, many other people do, allows us to actually tap into more of our wisdom, which helps us be more adaptable and more flexible and to be able to experiment more.
Yeah, amazing insight there, Danette. And I think that just shows the different ways that you can approach tension.
Yes.
So one, like I was talking about a physical one, but you're talking about one that you can kind of even go back and that you can see why the tension's being held in certain areas. Amazing.
Yes.
A lot of
Yes.
different ways. And I hope people, if they're feeling stressed or sort of tense, there's different ways to approach it. And these are all different ways to stay adaptable, I think.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Well, Danette, today we're talking to Dr. Richard Hodge, friend of the show.
Yes.
He's been on the show before, and we absolutely love to have him back. Did you have
Yes.
anything? Did you want to talk about how you know Dr. Richard Hodge, and then do you want to talk about anything that you want people to keep their eyes open for in the conversation with him?
Yeah. So, Dr. Richard Hodge is a genius. Met him through Thought Leaders Business School, which is run by Matt Church. He's a wonderful mentor to many, many thought leaders. And I love him because he's got such a wealth of experience around many industries and he's got such a brain that thinks so broadly. I loved to start with him, makes experimentation really easy. He's just like, try something new. I was like, how good's that? Yeah, in an organization where we're like, oh, it's got to be this, this, and this, just try something new. And I was like, I love that. And he points out that it's not the quickest of the series of species that survive. It's those that adapt most quickly to change in their environment. So us, we don't have to adapt all the time, although the world's getting closer to that. So obviously looking after yourself. But he was talking about how do we build what he calls participatory knowing through experimenting. So we're participating in learning and knowing as we go, and we're sharing it with one another. And part of that when you're working in organizations and experimenting is getting rid of the silos. Because the silos, we then hold that knowledge within that, and it obviously slows the process down. So there's heaps of insights that Dr. Richard Hodge brings, some great examples. He talks about one where they did experimentation over a 3-year time frame. So I like that time frame doesn't always, again, have to be short. But during that time frame, they did 40 experiments. So we can have a long-term outlook and then try many things to work out what's going to work or not. Anyway, I'll leave it there for the moment. I hope everyone enjoys this episode. And Jez, I look forward to your insights when we get back. And now to our conversation with Dr. Richard Hodge. Hello and welcome to Adapt with Danette FM. My name is Danette FM and today I am super excited. We are kicking off season 3 of our podcast and I have special guest who, if you didn't watch last season, you need to go back and watch his first episode. But Dr. Richard Hodge is joining me today and our theme this season is on experimentation. So in organisations, rather than making big changes, sometimes we experiment to move forward and adapt quickly. So Dr. Richard Hodge, welcome. And I'd love for you to introduce yourselves in case people missed last season's episode.
Well, thanks, Danette. It's a joy. I enjoyed our last conversation and look forward to seeing where this would go. And anyway, for those who don't know me, I turned 70 this year, which is a bit of a milestone birthday for me. And that's on the back of 50 years working in large organizations, or with large organizations. And the first 21 years of my professional career was in the Defense Science and Technology Organization, where I actually had the moniker of Experimental Officer Class 4. So maybe I've had a go at running a few experiments, but I think, frankly, it's just been a theme of life and living. And if you're not experimenting, you're not bloody well living. And I think that's part of the attitude I've brought to the way in which I engage with life. And thankfully, my wife of nearly 50 years has hung on, and we've enjoyed the ride together. So yes, so on the other side of that, very happily married, 2 children, and each of them have 2 children in loving relationships. So it's all part of life's experiment. That's me.
I love that introduction and happy birthday for this year. I turned 60 this year, so I'm
That's
very
in
much
July.
looking forward to the 60s. Let's start with our first question, which is I'd love to understand your definition of experimentation, particularly in terms of leadership and also in organisations.
Well, if leaders aren't trying something new, they shouldn't be calling themselves leaders. That's one. So whenever they're trying something new, they're experimenting, right?
Nice.
And we can get into a little bit about styles of experimentation, and from an organization's perspective, quite simply, I would reach back to Charles Darwin and say, well, look, it's not about the survival of the fittest. So forget about competition. Species that survive are those that adapt most quickly to changes in the environment. And so therefore, organizationally, organizations need to learn. The best way of learning is building participatory knowing through experimentation. And the best ways of leading is by leading teams in doing exactly that.
Nice.
and leading yourself in doing exactly that.
What
Is
a
that
great
enough of a
yeah,
definition? I think we'll
that's
uncover it because as we go on, I think that question will hang always in the background as being it it's less of a definition around trying something new and more about what you're doing and how you translate and keep your theory and practice in close connection.
I love that. Yeah. So I'm looking forward to unpacking that. So then my next question is, what was an example of a situation where experimentation really works? So something where you saw it just completely change perhaps the leaders and the organization.
Well, I got a feeling I might have told. Apologies if I told this story in our last episode, but it started with me being invited into a conversation with a general in defence, and this general had been given new assignment of running a new strategic policy and planning division, with the idea of understanding how the world was changing, understanding then within that change what was the role for the military, then given that role for the military, what capabilities did we need to spend our money on? And if we spent our money on them, would it work? And so he had 4 branches set up around there. And in this conversation, he was telling me about his new organization. And he said to me, well, Richard, I've got a feeling that if I don't intervene in some way, those 4 branches will create their own silos, their own cylinders of excellence, and they'll all spin and be completely disconnected. And he says, I feel what we need is some form of scientific overlay. And he says, and I seriously don't know what that means, that actually helps bring these and keep these 4 together as a large, organizational brain of the organization, as it were. And he said, so that's your job description if you want it.
I love that.
And and so that was, and then I had the freedom for 3 years. So the first thing that was necessary, I worked with each of them to understand a little of what they did, and within each of those ran little experiments. But I won't talk so much about that because that was little experiments to help build familiarity with experimentation,
Yep.
so that they were on side, right? And each of these branches was headed by a senior executive.
Yep.
So then the crucial one was where the money landed, right? So I worked exceptionally closely with that. And then he, who was a Navy Commodore or a 1-star admiral, then connected me with the people in his command chain, and eventually 2 levels above me and him was the Secretary of Defense and the Chief of Defense Force. And I was sitting in front of them explaining what it was we were going to, that I had, after about 6 months, had designed a way forward. And the Secretary of Defense said to me, well, Richard, I like what you're thinking, but it's going to take at least 3 years. And if you're not up for that sort of commitment, then we're not even going to start with this. So there was the first thing. To make it successful was getting sponsorship at the very top, right? And particularly in something as impactful as strategic planning. Anyway, we got into running a whole lot of seminar war games, is what we used to call them. But it's really a bringing together a dozen or 15 people and having a conversation. We'd created 14 different scenarios, what could happen in the world, and we were less interested in whether or not they were going to be true. But if they were, what would you do? And then on the other side said, well, look, how can we spend this money? Well, we can spend that 14 different ways, but we picked 3 and then tested those 3 ways of building a defense force in each of the scenarios. So there we were, and 40 war games later, because any one doesn't tell you too much, right? You get some sense that, yeah, okay, we'd strike problems or we wouldn't, or we'd have this issue or not. But when you hear the same message after 40, then you go, there's some substance here that we're, whatever we do, we will always need certain capabilities. And lo and behold, certain capabilities are only used in specialized conditions. And so you can get into better priority setting. And I ran that and sold that solely as an experiment. If it didn't work, we could go back to the old ways of doing strategic planning, right? And everyone was sort of happy with that, yeah.
I
But
love that.
in one of those, to build the executive buy-in, I ran one of the seminar war games over 3 days with all of the top 20 executives within defense. And they all participated. And the chief of army came up to me afterwards and he said, Richard, we've looked at this problem, which was a low-level problem, I must admit, of how we provide service-assisted evacuation for, a disaster in the Pacific. But he said, frankly, we would have sent, a team away and they'd have studied for 6 months and then come back with recommendations. But here, in 2.5 days, we've covered more, and we've built a confidence across the executive that, what our issues are and what remedies we would need. And we've done that in 2.5 days, not 6 months. And so that set a pattern for how strategic planning shifted within that organization, because they had long since discounted scenarios, because people were creating scenarios and then gaming them, to reverse engineer and say, of course we need this many aircraft.
I love
And so that was an example of a high-level situation of experimentation. Then that really worked. And anyone wants the write-up on that, it's in my PhD thesis as case study number 1. So go get it.
Awesome. We'll make sure we include a link with the podcast so people can have a look.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
But the crucial thing in that, and perhaps it leads into what I see as your next question around challenges. I'll continue to use that example because I sat with the Deputy Secretary Strategy, who was my boss's boss, and so one down from the Secretary.
Yep.
And I ran through the methodology, and he said, Richard, the critical vulnerability in this approach is who we get in the room, who gets invited to play in this experiment, right? Because if, for example, and I'll pick on Army again, if we've got someone in there that the Chief of Army doesn't trust to represent the Army view, then they can discount this work at the stroke of a pen.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
So the critical vulnerability was who you get to, and in fact, the Army representative in that experiment went on to be Chief of the Defence Force. So, and I'd worked with him as a lieutenant colonel, and but it brought huge buy-in, and what we found was that people started using the language of the experiment in the way in which they presented their own services views. It was it built a language
Yep.
that connected people, but challenges, yeah. sponsorship, and getting the right people involved.
Nice, nice. I love that you anticipated that. Any other challenges that people should be aware of if they want to get the experimentation right?
Well, I don't think that there is anything right. You see, and I think that's one of the big things that experimentation tries to get people to overcome is the mindset that there is one right way. No, that is a very reductionist, very deterministic view that there is one right way. And usually it comes from a fascist sort of leader that goes, "Hey, it's my way or the highway," right? But we see that in organisations, not just in politics, and so I think that the challenge is overcoming that mindset, and that an experiment can only be determined to fail if you learn nothing about the outcome you were seeking, if you learn nothing about the process, then of research. So you can get things wrong that you can't materially do, but what you can say is, well, we've closed off that avenue of thinking for now, and we've learnt something about the way in which we do experiments in this context, chasing that idea with these people. Because there's a constant mix of people, like running my experiments for at a macro scale, 3 years with 40 different iterations over those 3 years. People change, information changes, the methods available to you change, and the data changes because you're learning more as you go.
Yeah.
So when you've got that as the dynamic, you've got to realize that things will emerge that will surprise you, but that doesn't invalidate the experiment. It actually augments the learning that comes from experimentation. So
Wow.
I see experimentation very much as being the crucial process if an organization really wants to see itself as a learning organization.
Love that answer. And it leads beautifully into our next question, which is, how do we allow for more experimentation at work? So, given this is absolutely, we are in an environment which is rapidly changing, learning organizations are going to help us to be able to navigate that better. What do organizations need to do to make that whole idea of experimentation at work happen more?
Ask questions. For Christ's sake, don't give answers, ask questions. So like, we'll go back to the PhD, or anyone who's done a degree by research. The thing that you've got to land on, so what is your research question?
Yeah.
Right, PhD aside, come back to the question of how do we allow for more experimentation? Well, what if the manager or leader sat there and said, well, look, here's the issue. Here's what I've been thinking about it. And yes, and either invite people to contribute or go, just let me get all of this off my chest so you know where I'm coming from. And here's what I think might be a solution.
Mhm.
Then invite people to say, so what are the hard questions that line of thinking proposes, and invite people to bring their objections, to bring their support in terms of questions, and find the hardest questions, and they are usually the source of great experimentation.
Nice. Oh, I love
The
that.
other thing I'd say too is that, for all those leaders out there that go, no, stuff it, we've messed around with this for 3 years and we've just got to crack on and get it done. Well, right then, right there, you're starting an experiment on getting it done. The only thing is you're not setting it up as an experiment,
Yeah.
and that you are potentially setting yourself up to fail organizationally by not having an experimental mindset.
It's so true. Oh, that's beautiful. So then why is it important for leaders and organizations that want to adapt that they consider experimentation? What would happen if they didn't?
Oh, well, I've got a hard question for them. So what do you reckon is your time to extinction, right? Either as a leader in this organization or in the failure of your organization, because there's plenty of other leaders that are
Mm,
experimenting and
yes.
adapting. There are plenty of other organizations that are in your field that are experimenting and are adapting. Where do you want to be in the field? And if you're not experimenting, then you're not adapting.
Yeah.
And it ties into thinking about learning, right? And I think this is where, in many respects, leaders not just act as learners, but that yes, they should be the first learner,
Yeah.
right? And that means come with a preparedness to say, I don't know, or
Mm,
come with a preparedness to acknowledge, sorry, I got it wrong.
yeah.
How can we now, you know, get it get on a different tack? And and those are two hard things for leaders to do in a dominant culture of competition,
Yeah.
where there's always someone to take your job, and also by and large, organizations don't give a shit about you.
Yeah. Yeah.
Sad
Yeah.
but true, you yeah, anyone leaves an organization, it's like taking a hand out of a bucket of water, within a few moments, it'll be still again.
Yeah. Yeah. That's so true. Yeah. Yeah, yeah. And that whole, because that is part of leadership, actually going, I don't know the answer. And I failed in this particular, I stuffed this, I learnt this from this particular failure. And yet it still is often there's cultures that that's not safe to do, even as leaders.
Yes, look, and that's very true too. And I will avoid, so the pause there was me filtering out some political comment that
Yeah.
of political leadership. And so I won't mention that, but it's as crucial at that level as
Yeah.
well, right? But yet, as we in Australia here are about to, or we have really entered an election season, to some election either in April or May, whenever Prime Minister declares it. We won't see any sense of experimentation because that'll be driven down as a weakness, right?
Yes.
And that's why I'd come back to the whole idea of organizationally, you're at risk of the same um, competitive behaviorist overlay, and that what experimentation helps build is a deeper philosophy that is much more of constructive mutualism. That way we're in this together, and we're about building something for the future. And if you're not in that game, then um, it's pretty hard to get experimentation going,
Yeah.
because it is the art of working artfully together.
Yes.
And those who design and run experiments need to have all sorts of perspectives
Yes.
available. So not just the substantive technology application or reorganization outcome, but there are physiological, environmental, psychological, psychosocial, social impacts, potentially planetary impacts, as well as a consequence of that. And how do you bring So this is again comes back to who do you invite into the room to make sure that you've got a perspectival knowing, and then you've got a process that builds a participatory knowing, because your biggest learning comes for those people in the room or on the experiment comes from their participation. And that's the gold that you really want to harness.
Mm. And one of the things that's come to me, and I've definitely been focusing on this of late because I'm writing a series of 3 books on family business, and part of the reason I like them is that they don't just focus on the short-term results, but they think generationally. And I love the example that you brought, which we didn't talk about in the last one, so this is awesome news,
Ah,
new story, around, sometimes those experiments take 3 years to actually get to where we can move forward. So it's not, because sometimes people will think it's all short-term stuff, but actually having that long-term perspective
Well,
can help too.
yes, that's right. But it was a cluster of experiments, right? So
Yes.
yes, there was the long term, and that we were going to get some guidance or derive some guidance through analysis of what we've learned over 40,
Yeah.
40
Yeah.
separate experiments, and so each one, you've I wasn't a very good scientist, to be honest, but because I hated lab reports, right?
Yeah.
I wanted to just get
Oh,
on and run the next experiment. But they're so crucial.
yes.
You've got to actually capture that learning. You run a little thing, and a seminar war game could take as little as half a day, or maybe, as I talked about earlier, 2 or 3 days. Um, but at the end of that, you've got to stop and go, now, within the confines of this experiment, what was it about? How did we approach it? What did we learn? And you've got to get the methodology piece in there as well, because if it's determined to be a failure, well, what did you learn about the process? And
Yeah.
those little lab reports are absolutely crucial. So it's all just the sort of stuff you used to do at high school. It doesn't change too much in terms of its formatting, just the content, but getting that done, and then keep running experiments, right? Slightly different perspectives with different financial constraints or whatever other constraints you're going to apply on it. Then do your synthesis over all of those.
Yeah.
And that's really where you get the maximum organizational benefit that'll help shape thinking, the way learning is developed, and indeed organizational process and outcome. And you get all of those dimensions coming through over time. But there's a certain amount of patience required
So
because you want to learn your way forward.
yes.
It's an ecological way of approaching it, right? You learn your way forward by adapting.
Oh, I love that. And what I love is because I'm sure that some people who aren't that familiar with experimenting would think, oh, well, we'll do 1 or 2 and then we'll have the answer. One of the things that your example has shared with us, Richard, is that, sometimes it's over different times, it's multiple different experiments, in your case, 40. There would be some people who are not necessarily familiar with experimentation that probably are thinking, oh, it's just 1 or 2 experiments we do and then we'll have the answer. And,
Yes, maybe,
yeah, maybe, but maybe not, hey?
but maybe not. Have you adequately covered all perspectives, right? Yeah, that I listed earlier.
Yep. Love that. Love that. So let's come to our final question. I can't believe it's been such a fun
That's all right.
podcast.
We can circle back on some of the others.
We can. Awesome.
Because experiments, anyway, keep going.
I love it. So is there anything else that you'd like to share with our listeners and our viewers around experimentation?
Just do it. Well, in fact, now you are doing it, but you're just not realizing it. Look at the last thing. When was the last thing you did something new? Mm.
Nice.
How did you think about that? What steps did you take to make you think about the potential risks, upside and downside. And maybe some of that was subconscious, others parts of it conscious. So what constraints were in place? Did you relax the constraints in order to be able to move forward? So it's not always about adding things; it could be about taking things away as well. And that's as hard as experimentation needs to be. And I got to tell you, it's what made my 21 years within defence some of the best times of my life. But it continued after as well, because it just becomes the way of doing things. I remember at one time I was director of Woomera management, and there's a large restricted area within outback South Australia that is the Woomera Range.
Yeah.
And I was responsible for the policy and development of that area, including oversight of the technical support contract with a joint defence facility with America, right? But did I actively do experiments? I'm not sure that I did, in the way in which we think about experiments, of going through a design process and then a setup and then conduct it. But by jingo, we certainly changed the way in which we did policy, which itself was an experiment, because I would say to my people, well, what do you think makes best sense for the people in Woomera that are living there? What makes best sense for the business of Woomera, which is largely a defence focus? And what are the consequences for any of the local inhabitants beyond the actual Woomera township and the experiment, which of course is a fairly large Indigenous population? So then they might say, but there's a policy against this or a policy against that. I said, I don't care. Tell me if there is a law that says we can't do this, because if there is, then we've got a bigger problem. Then tell me who wrote the policy, because maybe all we'll do is write another bloody policy. And we'll go through a process of examining that policy with those different entities, which itself then becomes an experiment, right?
Love that.
So so experiments can happen just as simply in conversation of, let me test this idea with you. And after I was director of Woomera management, I ended up then as director of international programs in the Defence Science and Technology Organisation. And we were having a hell of a time with the way in which the US-Australia treaty arrangements were in place, because every time we wanted to run a little experiment between the two countries, it had to be written up on a bit of paper, and because the Americans regarded that as a binding agreement, for Australia, every single one of them had to be signed by the Governor-General in Executive Council. What an overhead. So one of the questions on me was, well, how can we fix this? And I came up with a way, checked with the Chief Defence Scientist, and he said, right, well, we need to get you off to Washington, and you can go and see what their equivalent, their counterpart, the assistant secretary for that part of the world, thinks of that idea. And so I walked into her office, Dr. Jean Mintz, lovely lady, sadly passed while in office, but lovely lady. And she sat down, and she was very fond of the way things were working, because for America it worked exceptionally well. Yeah. And I told her of the basic problems. And sorry, I said, we've got a problem, and I want to run an idea up the flagpole for you. So they're forecasting an experiment of sharing an idea. And she looked at me square in the eyes, and she said, well, Richard, you've got 10 minutes, and then I'm pulling that down. And sure enough, after 10 minutes in the Pentagon, for the first time, talking to an assistant secretary, she stopped the conversation and she said, "Just a moment, Richard." And she left the meeting room, comes back in with her military assistant, who's a Navy captain.
Yep.
And I'm sorry, I forget his name, but she said, "Captain, sit down here. You need to take some notes."
How wonderful.
5 years later, I had completed negotiations of a new treaty status document between the two countries, and stood there in the Secretary of Defence's office while he and the Australian Secretary of Defence signed that into force, and it lasted for 25 years. So, think
Wow.
about experimentation as just the testing of ideas, fundamentally the testing of ideas, and being open to adapting those ideas, because whatever you think is the problem, invariably you'll have the wrong definition of the problem, but you'll learn that if you take an experimental approach in the way in which you even just engage with ideas.
Oh, what a great answer, and what a great episode. So, great one to kick off this season. Thank you so much, Richard. Um, so I'm sure there will be people that would love to reach out and talk more to you. So let's share your details, and we'll make sure that they're
Yes.
listed on the podcast as well as the YouTube channel. Um, yeah,
So
tell me what.
on by all means, we'll do that, and you've got my LinkedIn contacts. But also, I'd like to draw your listeners' attention to my new Substack. So I've been starting as as I look at 70. I don't go out doing that sort of consulting anymore, but I'm trying to then write my own lab reports. What have you learnt over all this time, Hodge?
Oh,
and
so cool.
and I've set up a new Substack, and it's called No Problem Too Big, with the two being the numeral 2. No Problem Too Big, and really, my design behind that is to help people feel that no problem's too big for them to act, and leave the world better for what they've done. But and at its essence, at its heart, is take an experimental mindset, be open to perspectives, and find ways of working artfully together. And that is what makes experimentation successful.
Oh, I love that. Oh, I'm going to sign up for your Substack thing straight after this. So that's awesome. So Richard, I'm really curious about, is there anything else you'd like to share around experimentation?
Well, I've talked a lot about experimentation and encouraging people to do it because you will get benefit from it. And at one time I had, but you will also meet opposition, right? Because invariably, what we're talking about with experimentation is the art of of getting people working artfully together on hard issues to find out what is the common sense and the common value that would take the leadership and the organization forward. So then when you've got that distilled and it bumps into power who have different agendas, who want different outcomes for their own reasons, some of which might be that it's not a position they've ever supported, it might block their promotion, all of these sorts of things, and you may never know why they don't like it.
Yeah.
But and as a result, don't be surprised if your distilled common sense is thrown back at you, or literally thrown away. And I have had at least 5 instances in my life where my work, particularly around strategy, has been thrown. So, and I will be writing on my new Substack a series called "Strategy is a Game of Thrones." ROWNS.
Oh, I love that.
Because so the first time I experienced this, I had taken, at the end of that, towards the end of that 3-year period, we were going and briefing an admiral who was in charge of doing all the buying. So we've come up with the laundry list and whatever else. And he felt as though that had, obviated any need for his organization, and far from it. But nonetheless, we were sitting in front of the Vice Chief of the Defence Force, and he had my work like this, and he just threw it at the feet of the Vice Chief and gone, well, it's
Wow.
all just bloody common sense anyway, right? But what you just got to realize is that what you've done in your experiment is taken a hard question, explored multiple perspectives, distilled that down into common sense, and that is remarkably uncommon, right? And you've given them something that they can really hang their hat on. So just take that, if your work ever gets thrown, just as a mark of endorsement. It doesn't quite seem like it, but actually you've done good work, right? It's all just bloody obvious. Well, if it's that, why haven't you implemented it already is your next question. One other, I won't give you all 5, but one other, I was working with a large health organization, and we had the top 40 executives from that state. I won't mention the state. But we had one of the CEOs at the table. This is going back nearly 20 years now. But we were looking at how we can help that organization bring more future thinking into their strategic processes. So similar to defense in many respects. And the last workshop had all 40 in there, and I had 10 of them on my table. And one of these senior executives picks up my folder of work, mine and my mate's, Les, and says, well, it's all just a load of bloody bullshit. And she walks over to the nearest bin and throws it in the bin.
Whoa.
It's all just bloody bullshit, she says, and then came back empty-handed and sat back down at the table. So I went, and I just let the silence pervade, because clearly everyone in the room was paying attention. And I looked at her and I said, it's interesting, but you're going to have to help me reconcile something. Because this morning at breakfast, Les and I walked past one of your colleagues, and he said to us, he said, lads, most of the people around here will tell you outright that I'm a bloody hard marker. But this, and he had our folder in front of him, he said, this is some of the best strategy work I've ever seen. So well done, and good luck with the workshop today. So I looked back at her, having told that story. I said, so what should I make of your response? And she very mildly got up, walked to the bin, picked up the folder, and embarrassingly came back. So my coaching to your listeners is, don't be surprised if shit happens. It's not your shit, it's theirs, right? It's theirs. If you have gone through, addressed the question, being clear and transparent about your methodology and how you've derived the findings of your experiment, it's all there. And experiments are open to challenge. Ask them, what is the bit that you've missed? And they'll be short on answers, but they may well show you exactly where you've crashed into the power settings in the organization. have fun.
I love that too. And yeah, even that question at the end, which is you're still curious, you're trying to understand what's going on,
Yeah,
knowing that
totally.
obviously power is happening, but
Yeah.
that, draws out those insights and stuff. So that was beautiful and a really helpful thing for people who are going to experiment and hit power from time to time. So thank you so
No
much.
doubt about it. Power, it's not talked about, right? So all those leaders out there who talk about, hey, we've empowered our people. Oh, have you? Tell me, please, how you've had the conversation about power,
Yeah.
right? What power does that lady over there have? What power does that manager over there have? And so on and so forth. And if they can't then relate that into decision rights, openness to ask challenging questions, then they've got no real power at all,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
So don't talk to me about being empowered unless you're prepared to have the conversation about power.
Great insight. Thank you so much, Richard.
Well, what a great conversation with Dr. Richard Hodge. It's
Yes.
lovely to have him back, and you two, it's just great to see you have a conversation with him as well. So, Danette, did you have any thoughts from that conversation? It had a lot of different ideas in it.
It had so many, and I'm going to go and listen to it again. One that I think is really smart, that it is actually important to be politically savvy when you're doing experimenting in organisations. So you need to make sure that the right people are in the room. Otherwise, your experiments could get squashed pretty quickly. So that point I thought was really important. The other one, which I really like from a leadership perspective, is one of the ways we can encourage experimentation is not by giving the answers, but actually asking the questions and then getting your people to ask questions and then deep dive and experiment on the hard questions, because that's where we're going to get some really good results. Heaps more takeaways, but I think those two were absolute gold. What about you, Jez?
Yeah, I mean, as you said, there's so many good ones, but for me, sort of the big takeaway was just how much experimenting has to be seen as the ongoing process. It's not something we just choose to do once in a while. If we keep it going, then people's brains are more accustomed to not only the process of experimenting and understanding how to experiment, but also just the concept of losing occasionally. With experimenting, the hypothesis is not always going to be right, and the more you experiment, the more you get accustomed to that outcome.
Yes. Yeah, I love that, Jez.
Mm. Well, Danette, as I mentioned on every podcast, you're not just having conversations with guests this season, you are having conversations with listeners as well. And if they want to write in and ask you a question about adaptability or even this season specifically experimentation, they can do that at adaptwithdanette@gmail.com. But before we get into that, let's head over to the segment Title Card. Alrighty, this is Ask and Adapt. As I mentioned, this is where people can write in to you, Danette, to ask you a specific question to their life, and you can help them be adaptable and use your adaptive lens to help them. So this one's actually from someone called Jeremy, which was very exciting for me.
Nice.
That's also my name, so I always like to give them a bit of love. So this one's from Jeremy. Hello, Danette. I've been thinking a lot about your conversations and how fun they've been. How important is fun when learning and for staying adaptable? Thank you and excited for this season. Jeremy.
Oh, Jeremy, what a great question. I reckon fun is one of the critical ingredients for experimenting, and also for being adaptable. There's so many things where we were taught as kids to be serious and to concentrate. And yes, it's important to concentrate, but you can concentrate in a relaxed way and actually you work well better. You work way better with your brain when you're relaxed. Um, so some of the things I do to have fun, I love Julia Cameron's book, The Artist's Way, where she says once a week, take yourself off for an hour and do something just by yourself that is fun. So one of the things I did when I did that was going swimming with sharks in an aquarium. Now, obviously, they weren't killer sharks or anything like that. But just even doing that at a lunchtime, I went back to work after that and I was like, so alive, because One of the things I know is when we do stuff all the time that's really comfortable, we eventually become numb. And then our brain sort of gets a bit flat. And I was talking to a client this week, and they were saying, my work is not inspiring me anymore. And I was like, well, go back to your purpose. What's your purpose? But also bring in some new elements so that you have that fun, that newness to be able to keep your brain wide open. Yeah, I think also we don't get outside enough. So if you look at kids, like kids are a great way of learning how important fun is because when they're tiny, they fall over, they cry, but then they'll giggle and then they'll try again and then they'll fall over and they just keep doing it. Whereas when we get to adulthood, we become a bit more rigid. We have that perfectionist tendency and we don't have as much fun. So I think also just sort of acting a little bit more kid-like can be super, super helpful. But getting outside, both as a child, because kids create adventures. So I remember, Jez, when you were little, and you and Charlotte would get outside and play Nature Boy and Nature Girl. And you just would have fun with a stick. Like that's just awesome. So the other thing about nature is when we're in a closed room, and this came from a podcast that we had with Tim Jack Adams a couple of weeks ago, where he was invited in for a Think Outside the Box series or session, but they had him in a room with no windows and it was a box. And so he took the group outside because when we're outside, we've got the expanse of nature, whereas inside, we have man-made lines. So it's much more structured and that stops our brain from being a little bit more flexible, which we need when we want to experiment and we want to adapt. The other thing I love is traveling. Obviously, that's part of what I do because you have the cultural thing, doing meditation and stuff like that we spoke about at the story at the beginning. Retreats, that's also good. The other thing is asking your brain great questions like, how can I make this more fun? And there is always a way to make things more fun. We've just got to be in that playful space to be able to do that. So, Jeremy, a great question. Jez, what have you got to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, all great insights. And if you do want to hear from Tim Jack Adams, he's actually going to be a guest upcoming on this season of
Yes.
Adaptability and FM. So very excited for a future episode where he's on. But I just wanted to sort of echo that, Danette. And it's actually something that I've been living recently. So off of what you've been talking about, Danette, actually, I've changed my approach to working out recently because
Nice.
I've been thinking about this. Because when I used to coach basketball, my main philosophy was if you can get people to enjoy playing basketball, they'll practice in their own time. Like if you can
Yes.
make it enjoyable, then I don't have to teach them all the skills all the time, because if you can encourage them to do it as part of their own life outside of training, then they're just going to
Yes.
become better naturally. So,
Yes.
I mean, I do want to teach them skills and stuff, but I also want to encourage the passion that becomes the fuel. And I realized that I'd never applied that to my own working out. And so I'd always been outcomes focused. Like, what do I want
Yes.
to be the outcome of this, as opposed to what do I want the process to be? So I've totally changed how I work out now. Now what I do is I go, what would be the funnest thing for me to do? And then I
Right.
basically look at what I am not doing with my workout. So things that I don't typically like doing, like a leg workout, for example. How
Yes.
can I add an element to make that fun? So what I've done, for example, is I've just put this old dog toy on a bit of a rope and I swing it forward and back and I just duck under it like a boxer, because I'm like, that's something that I can introduce a bit of fun. I do
I love it.
in my backyard, I do a little bit of leg spin bowling, and then I do an all
Yeah.
over of that against some chairs, and then I go do 10 bicep curls or something, and then I go do another
Yes.
over. So for me, I've totally changed my approach, and what it's meant is that now I actually work out at the end of every day as a way to relax, because it's actually a fun way for me to get in the zone, because also when you're working out, it's much easier to be present. Um,
Yes.
and so I'm doing that and I'm having a lot of fun doing it. I'm not really worried about what my body's looking like per se. For me, it's just the fun about making sure that I have a way that I enjoy getting the blood pumping.
Yep. And I bet you're doing it more often
Yeah.
than you were when you were outcome focused.
Yeah, and the thing is, it's like I actually have to stop myself from doing it some days, because as we were talking about earlier in this episode, my muscles are sore, but my body like has the energy and want to actually do it.
Yeah. Yeah.
Mm.
What a great, and geez, what I love about that is when we become really outcome focused, we move more to the left brain, which has that perfectionist tendency. So it then starts to feel a bit heavy. So you've moved to the right brain, be in the present, have fun. And I suspect you're probably less likely to injure yourself too because you're in the present and noticing what's working and what's hurting and what's not. So, yeah, can't wait to hear more about that later on. I love that. I'm going to tomorrow when I go for my morning walk, actually apply that to my walk
Yeah,
and
I mean,
make it
it's
more fun.
why
Walking down a
not?
country road
Yeah.
is fun anyway, but I'm going to apply it and think how I can make it more fun.
Yeah, see if you can throw a rock into a tree stump or something. I don't know. Whatever you want to do, Jeanette. Jeanette, did you have any final thoughts on today's conversation?
Yeah, so Richard Hodge is an absolute genius. This conversation, as you said, he's a friend of the podcast. He brings such wisdom about experimentation. Um, just just do it. It's trying something new. I love that outlook. So,
Awesome.
Jez, any insights from you?
No, I just want to say thank you, everybody who's been listening and sharing.
Yeah.
And Jeanette, did you want to leave anybody with a message?
I'd just like to say, as Richard said, just try new things and until next time, stay adaptable.